We start. Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to this keynote speaker from Professor Tony Berber from University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Professor Berber, with the graduate program in Applied Linguistics and the Linguistics Department, the Catholic University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. His recent publications include multidimensional analysis, research methods, and current issues. 19 Bloomsbury, co-edited with Marcia Veirano Pinto. Multidimensional analysis, 25 years on 2014. John Benjamin's, co-edited with Marcia Veirano Pinto. Working with Portuguese Corpora, 2015. Bloomsbury, co-edited with Telma, Bento, Ferreira, and Cristina, Meyer. Metaphor in Specialist Discourse, 2015. John Benjamin's, co-edited with Berenike Herrmann. His main research interests are multidimensional analysis, the use of corpora for historiography and historical discourse analysis, the development of corpus methods for metaphor retrieval, the application of corpus techniques for forensic linguistics, corpus-based analysis for translated texts, and the interface between corpus linguistics and language teaching, and corpus linguistics and digital humanities. He's on the board of several journals and book series, such as International Journal of Corpus Linguistics, Corpora, Applied Corpus Linguistics, Metaphor and Social World, Studies in Corpus Linguistics, Register Studies and Metaphor in Language, Cognition and Communication. We are really very pleased to have in this third Congress of International Congress in Corpus in LP, Professor Tony Berber. It's up to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I want to share my screen with you. So yeah, I hope you guys can see this. If someone could shout in the chat. Can you?
Okay, it is perfect. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm really happy to be here and have been given this opportunity to talk to you all and to connect with people here in the continent. We don't do this often, unfortunately. And so this is a very important meeting that enables us to get together with our fellow researchers in South America and beyond. So my talk, I'll just follow this basic outline. I'm going to talk a little bit about corpus linguistics discourse, then I'm going to show you my data, talk about MD analysis, and also a discriminant function analysis, and final remarks. So let me thank you, Professor Jorge Mauricio Molina, for the kind invitation and for all the hard work you've put into preparing the conference, all your students and everyone else involved. And thank you especially to Andres for his help throughout. You can download my slides right away if you go to these URLs. The first one is for the slides. The second one is for the handout. So I think I'll have too much material to show you. I may have to rush through some of the details. And so if you want to go ahead and download the slides so you can just focus on particular aspects that I skipped or that I didn't pay much attention to. Also, the handout will give you more detail on many of the aspects of the analysis that are really in the background, and I won't have much time to talk about those details. So if you guys want to go ahead, take a picture of the screen and then download those two files, I think that might be a good idea. So I have 40 minutes. All right, so first of all, let me tell you, this is work in progress, not least because the corpus that I've used is still growing day by day. So I had to stop with the corpus downloads at the end of September. And so I'm going to keep doing more downloads until maybe the first half of next year. So all of these findings are tentative. And so, but I hope that they will shed some light on the findings that will come in the future. So the goals here are to identify the major discourses across text in English related to the coronavirus pandemic, and it determined the extent of the variation related to the country in which the text was published, when the text was published, the news sources that put out the texts, and even the political leaning of the news sources. So in terms of the broad field of corpus linguistics, I stand in between these two major schools, because on the one hand, we have this Birmingham, Lancaster kind of general corpus linguistics school where you look at lexical patterning, and you do this through a corpus approach, meaning your corpus is basically your unit of analysis, the whole corpus approach. And this has been pioneered by people like John Sinclair, Tony McEnery, and Jeffrey Leach, and others. And on the other hand, we see this Flagstaff School of Corpus Linguistics, which has pioneered MD analysis using multivariate techniques and quantitative techniques. And you do follow a text approach with this school where your unit of analysis is the text as opposed to a whole corpus. And this is, it's the brainchild of Doug Biber, and now there are lots of other researchers associated with this school. So I stand in between, because my students and myself, we look at lexical patterning here, but we do that through an MD approach, and we do use the text as our unit of analysis. So we're sort of bridging those two schools, if you will. All right, so I'm going to talk about discourse. So discourse has lots of different meanings, and so this one. We can talk about discourse, for example, in terms of an ensemble of ideas, concepts, categorizations that are produced, reproduced, and transformed in a particular set of practices. And these practices and ideas give meaning to social realities. So we're looking at social realities. And by the way, all of these quotes that I'm giving are stemming from the work of Foucault in some way or another. Also here, discourses frame problems. So I think this is very important, because the discourses that are floating around shape the way we see things. So they frame our point of view in particular ways. Also, we can look at discourse as ways of looking at the world, of constructing objects and concepts in certain ways. So the pandemic, so the way we see the pandemic is shaped by these discourses that will frame the way we see it. and how we understand it, and how we act in the pandemic. Also, discourse as a set of meanings, representations, statements, and so on that produce a particular version of events. So there's no such thing as a true version. So there are different versions out there, and these are represented in different ways through these discourses. So here I'm highlighting the connection between topics and discourse. So there's a relationship here because a discourse is also a group of statements which provide a language for talking about that is representing a particular kind of knowledge about a topic. So the discourses are this more abstract level, and the topics are more concrete. So we talk about things, but the way we talk about and how we choose to talk about those things are shaped by the discourses. And at the same time, those do shape the discourses. So it's a two-way street between topic and discourse. And my way of approaching this is through the topic. So the topics are the doorway to the discourses, if you will. So we get to the topics, and then from the topics, we can have a glimpse of the discourses that are acting upon those topics. All right, so in terms of the methods for discourse analysis, there are two very broad methods, right? So on the left, you have this more traditional method that is text-based. So you look at text, individual texts, using a hand and eye approach, meaning you do look at each one of them and you interpret the text. And this will impose a restriction whereby your samples are normally small samples because of the way that you have to approach each text. So you do a close reading of the texts in this approach. The other approach, the one that I'm following here, is a corpus-based approach, which uses computer-assisted methods instead of the individual hand and eye approach. And so this enables us to approach very, very large data samples. However, by doing that, we cannot do the close reading as a starting point. We do what we might call distant reading, where we don't approach each text individually as we would do if we were reading the texts as human beings. So we get the computer output, and then we make interpretations based on those outputs. So the other point I'd like to raise about this is that this distinction is also important, not just for discourse analysts, but also for human beings. I think that as language users, we are very, very much affected by this flow of texts that are just floating around and in tremendous quantities. So I think I would argue that we, as human beings, we do a distant reading of reality and of the text more often than we do a close reading. So because there's so much to keep track of, and there's so much information out there, I think we don't pay much attention to individual texts, but we do follow those major topics, those major discourses from a distant reading perspective, if you will. So by engaging with discourse through this perspective, I think we're kind of getting to the perspective that most people follow in their daily lives by being affected by large, major discourse formations rather than individual information based on individual texts. All right, so here are the corpora that I used. I used as a main corpus the coronavirus corpus from English Corpora. I downloaded the corpus. There's an online version that you can access. However, I did download all of the 39,000 texts. I also downloaded the iWeb corpus. So each one of these are very, very large corpus. So the coronavirus corpus covers a period from January to September, but it's growing day by day. So I had to stop on September 30th, but now I'm continuing to download and to do more analysis. So what I'm presenting today is a snapshot of this period from January through September. I use the iWeb as a reference corpus for the keyword extractions. So the coronavirus corpus is a sample of the now corpus, the news of the world corpus, which contains 11 billion words. And it's a sample, comprising 4.2% of the now corpus. And the way Mark Davies prepared the coronavirus is by picking articles from the now corpus that had at least 2 occurrences of these words, coronavirus, COVID, or COVID-19, and articles that had one of or more of the following words in the title. So words such as at risk, cases confirmed, contagious, and so on. However, when I downloaded the corpus, I ran some spot checks on the text, and I noticed some texts did not have much to do with the pandemic. And so I also ran further filters through the corpus, and so to remove texts that did not refer to the coronavirus pandemic. So my sample is a further reduced version of the corpus that you get from the from English Corpora. So in terms of the size, the corpus is broken down into these national subcorpora, meaning where the text came from, where they were published. So it's heavily biased toward the US, right? And then the second one, the largest subcorpus is the Indian subcorpus, then the British, Canadian, Irish, Australian. But as you can see, you have a whole range of countries here. And the ZZ country, if you're wondering, that is an unknown source. So this represents texts which have not been assigned to any particular country. Okay, so I extracted keywords, and as you may know, keywords were first introduced in corpus linguistics by Mike Scott. Mike Scott used a word-based approach, but I've used a text-based approach following Egbert and Biber. And so my keywords are words that are used in more texts than normal. So I calculated a log likelihood statistic for each word in the coronavirus corpus against the iWeb corpus using the log likelihood formula, where you compute the expected count of text in the coronavirus corpus for that word, and then you compute the expected count of text in the iWeb corpus, and then you compare the two. And if I use as a cutoff a significance level of 0.05, and then from those I took the top 300 words that had the highest log likelihood values. All right, so I used those words in this lexical MD analysis. There's 2 kinds. the grammatical MD analysis and the lexical one, I'm following a lexical one. So a lexical MD analysis looks at the underlying parameters of lexical variation, whereas a grammatical one looks at the underlying parameters of grammatical variation. But both of those use multivariate statistics. Linguistic features are different, of course. Here, for the lexical one, we're looking at lexis, in this case, individual lemmas. And the interpretation is different because in most cases with a grammatical MD analysis, you interpret the patterns from a functional perspective, whereas with a lexical one, I normally approach it from a discourse-based perspective. So when you see all those features coming together across texts, they do share something in common. So with a grammatical MD analysis, normally you see that as an underlying function, whereas with the lexis, I normally see that as underlying themes that open the door for us to see the underlying discourses. So the method is basically you tag a corpus, you lemmatize it, then you get the lemmas, you count the lemmas per text, and then you select, in my case, I selected the top 300 ones. You run an initial factor analysis, then you do a rotated factor analysis, then you standardize the counts and you compute a factor score. And then you go back to the texts, because then you need to interpret those factors. And when you do interpret them, you consider them dimensions. Factor analysis is a statistical procedure based on the idea of parsimony, meaning you want the fewer possible elements that you can get. So the less, the better in this case. And each factor is a set of correlated features across text. So if one of these circles is a text, then you can see that these two texts have these two elements in common. And because they're shared across many texts, they become a factor, right? And then these two other elements right here do not occur when the first two do occur. So you get an opposition between these two elements and those two within the same factor. So we talk about positive pole and negative poles, just two sides of the same coin for each factor. All right, so let's look at some findings. What did I get out of all of this? So what are the major discourses? So I got a very major discourse here, which is an opposition between an economic concern and a human health concern. So these are very different things. So the economic concern comes up in things like this. So New York Post publishing big story saying the economy of New York City is dying, so on and so forth. And they have to do something about it. And I'm sure wherever you are in the world, you may see the same discourse, right? Or similar discourses like this one. And here are the loadings. So the major words are economic, economy, global impact, recession, crisis. That's for the economic concern. For the human health concerns, you get words such as test, positive health testing, resident. So to me, what's interesting is that these two are opposed. So you have this economic concern, which has nothing to do with human health concerns and vice versa. And I think this is one of the major problems with this pandemic. And this is reflected in the texts very, very clearly. So here are some examples. This text from India, as you can see, it's talking about the impact of the recession, the disruptions in the global supply chains, and the slowdown in the economy. This text from the USA also talking about the coronavirus pandemic and how it affected the economy and caused an economic downturn and recessions. This one from a known country. So the WTO predicts a coronavirus downturn, the pandemic is to blame, and so on and so forth. However, those discourses also change what those words actually mean. Take a word like economy, and I got the top 100 collocates for each from each of those two corpora. So the iWeb is sort of the non-coronavirus corpus, right? So in the non-coronavirus discourses, the word economy is normally associated with things such as booming, a capitalist, changing, competitive, creative, emerging, improving, modern, robust, stable. So none of these collocates appear with economy in the coronavirus corpus. In the coronavirus corpus, an economy is associated with afloat, with battered, with critical, with fragile, negative, resilient, struggling. So as you can see, two very, very different representations of the economy. And that's just one word in the factor. Okay, with the human health concerns, for example, this is a typical text, right? From a health clinic explaining to you what are some of the tests you can take, which one is more appropriate for you, things like that. Here's a text from the US saying patients should test themselves, and that will help the city and will help the people. So an increase in testing will lead to less infection and things like that. This one is talking about asymptomatic patients and things like that. This one about the use of swabs for testing. So, and when we look at the countries where these discourses are coming from, we see this is more pronounced in Sri Lanka than in Tanzania. However, the amount of variation capture is tiny, it's just 0.8%, which is just so tiny. And the reason is that there are very, very large standard deviations. So when you get the mean, most texts are not around the mean, so they're everywhere. And that's what's driving the low variation here with the R squared. As far as the time series, again, very, very low R squared. And if you take the collocates of health, for instance, you can see they're very, very different. So I used the COCA corpus for this one because the iWeb corpus would not let me search for health. But as you can see in a non-coronavirus discourse, you get health associated with affordable, clean, comprehensive educational, things like that. Whereas in a coronavirus corpus, you get harsh, infectious, pandemic, pre-existing, vital, vulnerable, unprecedented. So very, very different representations of health. Okay, the second discourse is one associated with monitoring the spread of the disease. So here's a first page of the New York Times that reflects this kind of discourse. So they're saying the US had reached 100,000 deaths. Big headline. And here's some of the words that loaded. So you have case, death, report, toll, confirmed, tally. And so here's an example of that discourse, this one from India, reporting a spike in cases, a death toll, rising, in terms of the country mean, so Bangladesh has the highest score for this one. However, again, the R-squared is low because of the high standard deviation. So the country of origin does not explain the variation. Neither does time series. So although there's a rise here in the first months of the year, that variation is not well patterned. The third discourse is the discourse around symptoms. So here's one example, diagram showing you the different symptoms and how the symptoms for coronavirus differ from the symptoms for the flu and the cold. And here you get words such as cough, virus, disease, fever, symptoms, sneeze, spread, and so on and so forth. And so here's an example, text explaining what coronavirus is, what the symptoms are, how the illness is caused by the virus. Again, the country means, you see, again, the R-square is very, very low, so we should not pay much attention to that in terms of the country as being an important source of variation. Time series, the same thing. So the fourth one, I called it new social rules. So here's a typical text telling you how to use the beach, right? How to teach people how to change their behavior in terms of how they go to the beach. So all of these new social rules. So you get here things such as social distancing measures, restrictions, gatherings, lockdown, things like that. So here's a text from Nigeria where the governor is imposing a curfew and new strict measures and social distancing and things like that. This one from the UK talking about easing of lockdown restrictions. Again, the countries, you see Bangladesh here at the top. However, the R-squared is low. Same thing with the time series. And the last one, the last discourse refers to hospitalization. So we see things like that. So a person in healthcare saying, we risk our lives to save yours. So this kind of discourse comes up with words such as minister, government, COVID, medical, hospital, isolation, and things like that, quarantine. Here you have a text from India where the prime minister is asking those other ministers to do something, all right, about the hospitalization concerns. Here, this one from Singapore talking about how hospital staff are protecting themselves and so on. Again, the countries do not explain much of the variation, nor does the time when the text was published. So I'm trying to see where's this variation coming from? So I used a random effect model where I also put in source. So the source of the news, meaning where it was published. So with the source, we see that we get a little bit of the variation accounted for. For dimension 1, the source represents 14% of the variation. It's more than the other factors. With dimension 2, 11, then 3, 11, and 4, 8, and 5, 14. But so most of the variation is still unaccounted for. So I wonder if you guys have any ideas. Where is this variation coming from? So we know there's variation, but I cannot pin it down. So I also did a discriminant function analysis trying to predict. So again, using the multidimensional model, we could not predict where the text was published. However, I abandoned the dimensions for a while and looked at individual words. So it turns out, yeah, you can predict to a very good degree the source where the country, where the text was published. The Jamaican texts are the best, most predictive, more predictable texts. Over 53% of the texts could be correctly assigned based on individual words. For Jamaica, for Nigeria, 46, for Hong Kong, 44. So here are some of the words that predict the most. For Myanmar, the word transacted really predicts a text from Myanmar. From South Africa, the word non-necessary. For the US, end of day. For Australia, bushfire. So all of these individual words do predict the texts. Here's, for example, for Jamaica, this set of words: work from home, sanitizing, ill, hand wash, downturn, quarantined, and many more. So this set of words give away the source. So if you see a text with lots of these words, that's normally one from Jamaica. If you see one with lots of these words, normally it's from Nigeria. And I'm just looking at the top ones, all right? So Jamaica, Nigeria, Hong Kong. So from Hong Kong, these words, lots of hyphenated words, right? So these are probably not used around the world as often as in Hong Kong. So the last thing I want to do is then talk about if we can predict the political leaning associated with the news source. So I took a sample of the corpus, which I call the liberal subcorpus, with text from CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times. And I took a conservative sample of text published by Fox News and the New York Post. And I took even-sized samples, 3,100 texts each. It's a small sample. And I tried to predict, right? Can we predict the politics behind the text? Yeah, we can. So liberal text, I was able to predict the text 75% of the time. So the liberal texts are easier to predict than the conservative texts, which is interesting. So what does that tell us about conservative discourse, right? So the best predictors for the conservatives, the word coronavirus predicts a conservative text more than a liberal one, right? For instance, the word unemployment. So the word unemployment is usually, it can predict a text from a liberal source more than a conservative one, which is also interesting. So here are the most discriminant words for conservative. So like I said, coronavirus is very, very important. Report, statement, reopening, in fact, infectious, things like that. For the liberal ones, liberal text, so country is number one. I would never have predicted that. If you ask me, I would think that the word country was more associated with conservative discourse, but not here. And unemployment is an important one, like I said. So here are my final thoughts for today. So we looked at 5 major discourses around the pandemic. So the most salient one, the dimension one, makes a distinction between caring for the economy, caring for the people, which is a false opposition, right? Those two things should not be opposed. Number 2, the country of publication is a poor predictor of the variation because these discourses are global. So you cannot pin down where it's coming from. It's sort of a global discourse. Number 3, the time of publication is also a poor predictor. So these discourses come and go any time of the year. But perhaps if we have a longer sample, then we might see some trends. And number 4, the new sources of the story is a moderate predictor. So where the story is coming from shapes its discourse more than anything else so far. And number 5, so it's possible to predict all of the countries and even the political leanings by looking at the individual keywords, all right, rather than dimensions. So the individual keywords are better predictors rather than these broad discourses. And with that, my friends, I say muchas gracias. Gracias to you all. Thank you for your patience. And again, here are the links for if you want to download the slides and the handout. Here are the references, some of the references. And here are the links again. So with that, I hand it over to you guys.
Wow, unbelievable. It's amazing all that information you gave to us. And thank you very, very much for this very, very interesting conference that you present. I think we have some questions from the, remember that you can type and send the questions you have in order to ask to the Professor Berber. And
I can see questions here.
Yeah. Well, the first one is from Riseli Mendoza. What possible theories, frameworks can we use to analyze corpora in discourse? What do you think?
Well, first of all, let me say hi to Riseli. She's a follower of our webinars. How are you doing, Riseli? I hope you were good. Yeah, so as far as the theories, there's very, very different theories. The one I used is based on the work by Foucault, and as you saw, so Hall, Stuart Hall, I think can contribute a lot. Also Paul Baker. So Paul Baker is a leader in discourse analysis from a corpus perspective. So I would suggest those two authors very strongly.
And the second one is, what might be good topics in discourse for possible research?
Oh, I think anything that is anything that is touching social reality in some way. So the coronavirus pandemic is affecting the way we live and the way we think and the way we act and the way we elect our officials and so on and so forth. So this one has a real bearing on people's lives. So I would say, Riseli, anything that is relevant to your community or to the whole world, from either a contemporary perspective or a historical perspective, anything that makes us understand or enables us to understand the way we live. I think any topic that is within those constraints, I think, are good topics.
She also says that, do you think it's possible that your study could be replicated in Philippine context?
I think so. If you download the coronavirus corpus, you can pick the sample from the Philippines. However, if you do not want to download the whole corpus, because that takes a long time and you have to spend some money too, you can go to the coronavirus corpus website, and you can run searches, and you can specify that you want to select only text from the Philippines.
And in your research, Tony, had you found or identified novel words of neologism, new compound words, new blended words, and new expressions?
Yeah, so I mentioned some of those hyphenated words. Those are sort of new words. So in terms of the concepts, yeah, like I mentioned, even usual everyday words like economy, I lost the screen. Oh, here you are. Okay, sorry. So even words like that, they're routine words. They have changed meaning. So the economy now means something different from what it was meant in normal times. or even health. And I'm sure if we look at each one of those, we'll see a shift in meaning.
And there's a very interesting question: is there is a truthful corpus of the COVID-19 in Spanish? If so, any of from South America? Do you know about corpus in Spanish? Maybe.
I'm not so sure with the Spanish. I would suggest you look at the Corpus del Español, which is compiled by Mark Davies, and maybe they will have sorry, Mike. So they will have a version of the now corpus in Spanish. And then if you get the now corpus in Spanish, then you can search for coronavirus, COVID, and create your own subcorpus.
From Brazilian Portuguese, do you found something?
Yeah, so I think that I would suggest the now corpus in Portuguese, which is also compiled by Mark Davies. And then if you want, you can then search for texts that contain the word COVID and coronavirus, and then compile your own coronavirus in Portuguese, corpus in Portuguese.
But Professor Berber, I think it's that you found for English is free, no? It's free corpus, it's free corpora. You can access. Yeah.
Sorry.
But
all of those.
Yeah.
If you wanna use them online, they're free. But if you want to download the corpus, then you have to pay. So okay. Yeah, it's a few $100s each one, and you get discounts if you buy more than one. So for the kinds of things I showed you, I do need the corpus on my computer. So the online version would not work for that.
Okay, the thing is, it's very difficult to find free corpora. It's almost impossible. And even in this moment with COVID, it's very difficult to find resources in order to study this phenomena.
Yeah, you're right. So I would suggest people go to englishcorpora.org and look for so even though it's called English Corpora, you do have corpora of Portuguese and Spanish too.
There is there's a comment. Claudia Delfino says, maybe political ideology on the newspaper is where the highest variation lies. What do you think?
I was thinking that. When I picked, so first of all, hello, Claudia. She's my student. Hello, how are you? So, as I showed you, I got samples from liberal sources and conservative sources. And so I was able to predict those two to some extent or pretty well. So yeah, I think Claudia has a hunch there, and I think that's a good one.
Professor Rogelio Nazar, he asks, why did you use individual words? Perhaps you will obtain better results in the predictions if you use word engrams sequences of words. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think they might be more predictive. Yeah. So I'm going to have a look at that and try it out and see if it works. Thank you for the suggestion.
The thing is, we have a lot of questions, Professor, and we have not so much time. I think I'm going to see two questions more, if you agree.
Sure. Yeah, and if people can have my email, and I would love to hear from everyone. All right.
Yeah, Professor Jorge Sanchez says, Professor Berber, what do you think there is a variation in the use of particular words lexical in your corpus throughout time? What can this variation be associated with?
So with this corpus, we did not see the variation from being a strong variation from a statistical point of view. So the sample is not a long sample, so we cannot see those patterns clearly. There might be patterns that are time-oriented, but so far I have not seen them. But maybe, as I said, it's because there isn't much time in the corpus, just 9 months. So the discourses haven't shifted that much. So I think if I had at least 2 years, then we would see a bigger shift over time across those discourses, right? For instance, when a new vaccine comes in or different world leaders are elected, things like that. So we might see shifts that are patterned within the dimensions.
And I know there is a lot of questions. You may not imagine that. And I just going to pick up this one from Professora Irina Cristina. She's from Colombia. And she says, do you pick up text products produced originally in English or also text translated into English? Do you think this variable is important to take into account in your analysis?
Oh, that's a very good question, Irina. Thank you. I had not thought of that. So you might have something there, yeah, because we know that texts get translated. So, however, since those texts are in English, normally they are produced firsthand. However, because if I was using a corpus of Portuguese, for instance, then I would tell you, yeah, many of those texts would have been translated, at least portions of those texts, because the news sources here, they get texts that are sent by wire, so, like from Reuters and all of those news sources, and then they get translated. However, with English, I'm not so sure. However, it's a good question. Thank you.
And last one, because I think it's important. Professor Stefan Hughes, he says, would the difficulty to identify sources, nationalities of text based on the fact that authors may reside in a country different from their birth? What do you think about this?
Okay, Stefan, hi. So Stefan is my student too. Hello, Stefan. So,
all your fans.
So he's asking whether the author's nationality would have something to do with the variation. It might, I think so. However, I have no metadata on the nationality of the authors, and some texts have no authors really. They're just authorless in a way. They come from these news agencies, right, where they're just written by lots of different people at the same time, and then they get edited, and then they get reprinted, and then portions of those texts get moved around, and somebody else writes something in the text based on portions of other texts. So there's plagiarism all around, and so I would not be able to model that kind of variation, unfortunately.
I think we have to finish because in 1 minute we have to go to open the rooms from the sessions about different speech of this Congress. I really want to thank you very, very much for this amazing and very, very interesting speech, Professor Tony Berber. We're really very, very glad, very, I don't know, I have no words to thank you for this, to be here, but, in this situation, and exchange with us all those very, very interesting research, what you're doing in this moment. Thank you very, very much, Professor.
Okay, no, believe me, it's my pleasure. It's great. I really do appreciate your thinking of me for this and having me here. And it was a pleasure meeting you, Jorge and Andres, and being able to talk to you, all of you guys. Keep up the good work, okay?
Yeah, we hope to see you in real person
Yes.
briefly. I hope.
Yeah, me too. Take care.